Hi, I'm Lisa Kudrow. I'm glad you're here today. Mental health care and education is important to me. That's why I chose to become involved at UCLA, joining the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors and emceeing the galas and #WOW, the Wonder of Women Summit. I'm so excited that WOW and UCLA's Friends of Semel Institute Open Mind have joined together to bring outstanding, free virtual programs about mental health issues. This means you will hear conversations on the intersection of culture and science between renowned authors and filmmakers who share their personal stories and world-class UCLA scientists that highlight the latest in mental health research, care, and progress. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our Open Mind WOW series and hope to see you at many more programs.
Hi, I'm Vicki Goodman, and I too would like to welcome you to today's Open Mind program on behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA, the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors, and WOW, the Wonder of Women. Thank you to our wonderful friend, Lisa Kudrow, for her warm welcome and for her dedication to mental health programs at UCLA. We are honored to have with us today David Kessler, one of the world's foremost experts on healing after loss and the author of 6 books, including the new best-selling book, Finding Meaning, The Sixth Stage of Grief. David co-authored 2 of the books with the late world-renowned psychiatrist and pioneer in the psychology of dying, Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. And his first book, The Needs of the Dying, received praise from none other than Mother Teresa. David's personal experience as a 13-year-old child witnessing a mass shooting while his mother was dying in a hospital inspired him to begin his journey. For most of his life, David has taught about the end of life, trauma, and grief. However, despite his vast knowledge, his life was turned upside down by the sudden death of his 21-year-old son. It moved him to write his newest book, Finding Meaning. In this infamous year of 2020, David's wisdom has gone viral. From his article in the Harvard Business Review, his interview in the New York Times at the beginning of lockdown, to his interview with Brené Brown, which became the #1 podcast in the world. The audio of Finding Meaning has now been submitted by Simon & Schuster for consideration for a Best Spoken Word Grammy nomination. We are also honored to welcome back to the Open Mind Rabbi Steve Leder, Senior Rabbi of Wilshire Boulevard Temple, who will join David Kessler in discussion. Rabbi Leader is the author of 3 books, including More Beautiful Than Before, How Suffering Transforms Us, which he spoke about at an Open Mind program in 2018, back when our programs were still in-person events at UCLA. Thank you, coronavirus. His 4th book, The Beauty of What Remains, will be released on January 5th. And guess what? We didn't waste a moment in inviting Rabbi Leader right back here for an Open Mind program on January 11th to talk about his new book. So please mark your calendars and reserve now. A huge thank you to both of our preeminent and distinguished scholars for taking the time from their busy schedules to share their knowledge and expertise with us. Both David Kessler and Rabbi Leader examine the many ways we can transform physical, psychological, or emotional pain into a more beautiful and meaningful life. We have brought them together today to help us make sense of the collective grief that so many of us are experiencing right now from the effects of the coronavirus that has touched all of us in some way, and from the grief from personal losses, which we all will experience during the trajectory of our lives. Throughout the pandemic, David Kessler very generously and thoughtfully set up a daily free Facebook grief group to help people suffering loss and grieving during these challenging times. Similarly, Rabbi Leader in interviews on the Today Show, and in Shabbat Friday night sermons, now delivered via email at sundown to all Wilshire Boulevard Temple families. Full disclosure, our family is one of them, has helped us make sense of this challenging time, to find joy amid the grief, to find joy in simple pleasures like Rabbi's favorite rye toast with butter, and I'm going to counter that with cinnamon raisin toast with almond butter, and to find the silver lining amidst the hardship. A few housekeeping notes. Today's program is being taped, so if some of your friends, family, or colleagues were not able to join us today, they will have the opportunity to view the presentation and other past Open Mind programs on our website, friendsofthesemmeleinstitute.org, where you will find our YouTube channel. Please be sure to check out our videos from past Open Mind programs that you may have missed. Our program will run for 1 hour, with the last 15 to 20 minutes reserved for your questions. That means you will be done at 6 p.m. in time to watch the Lakers game. Everyone's Zoom has been automatically set to mute, and we ask that it please remain in this mode. If you would like to ask either of our participants a question, please type it into the Q&A, which you will see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible in the time allotted. Getting back to silver linings, one silver lining that I see is that we are fortunate to have modern technology to facilitate email sermons, Facebook grief groups, and Zoom Open Mind programs. So without further ado, let's begin our journey to find meaning and beauty during the coronavirus pandemic and beyond by giving a warm virtual welcome to David Kessler and Rabbi Steve Leder. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vicki. I really appreciate that. An honor to be here with you and your organization, and certainly have enjoyed through this experience of the coronavirus getting to know the rabbi in a strange way that we've met. He's been one of the speakers in my grief group that was set up to help so many people who were left alone. So I will share for a bit about sort of what brought me here, and then I believe the rabbi will also share. As was mentioned, I came into this work by my mother dying when I was 13. I wasn't able to be there with her. At the same time, one of the first mass shootings in the US occurred. And it's the kind of thing in our childhood that it either paralyzes you or it changes your trajectory. And it certainly changed the trajectory of my life and put me on this path to helping myself, figuring out how to heal, and then going on to learn to heal others, help them in their healing journey. I always say when I use the word healing, I never mean forgetting. Sometimes people are afraid that's moving on or forgetting. That doesn't happen in grief. Anyone who's been in grief knows that. So I worked for decades in hospitals and on my own, teaching therapists and counselors and nurses and physicians about grief. As was mentioned, I was privileged to work with Elisabeth Kübler-Ross when she adapted her stages of dying to stages of grief. I always say up front, we said on page 1 of our book, they're not linear. There's no map for grief. There's no one right way to do grief. All of the issues people tend to have with the stages, we actually addressed on page 1, but people often don't get that far. To know that our grief is a very organic experience, and there's no one grief model for it. The stages most of you know are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So I lived that world and worked that world. And then a few years ago, my younger son, David, unexpectedly died. And it is as brutal as anyone would think it is, and still is. And it's interesting, I was mostly, of course, the father who had to bury a son. But I also had a mind of a grief expert. And the grief expert's mind would watch in and go, yeah, you're in the stage of anger. Yeah, you're in denial. And those would all happen maybe in an hour. And one of the things that had been something that Elisabeth and I had been so bothered by is somehow acceptance had taken on a finality that we never intended. When people ask me, how long will I grieve? How long will my sister or my spouse grieve? My answer has always been, well, how long are they going to be dead? Because if they're going to be dead a long time, it means you're going to grieve a long time. But the goal of grief work for me is always to have helped people grieve eventually with more love than pain in their own way at their own time. So the grief expert noticed me going through all these grief experiences as a father that I taught about for so many years. And when I began to wrestle with acceptance, it wasn't enough. There was no way I was just going to let acceptance be it. I'd studied Viktor Frankl's work. I was so curious about meaning and how meaning intersects with grief and loss. And I decided to start interviewing people who had had a spouse die, a parent die, a child died, how they found meaning. And that became the new book. And I was so honored that the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross family and foundation gave me permission to add a stage, the sixth stage of meaning, to her iconic stages. So that's the work and the life that brought me here. And I'll turn it over to the rabbi here.
Okay. Thank you, David. It's a great honor for me to be participating with you. I read your book. I've learned a lot from you, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Let me say just a word about my new book and why I wrote it, or how it wrote itself. I was a rabbi. I've been a rabbi for more than 33 years, and this book is just coming out. The book is called The Beauty of What Remains: How Our Greatest Fear Becomes Our Greatest Gift. And the book is the distillate of everything I've learned about death, about dying, death, and grief as a death, dying, and grief professional, self-corrected by the experience of a son burying a father. In rabbinical school, we are taught the facts of death. You know, what are the appropriate prayers to say at the appropriate times, etc. But we learn none of the truths of death. So I spent 32 years helping people through this experience without ever having truly deeply experienced it myself. And so my new book is, in a sense, an apology, an attempt to set the record straight for everything I got wrong about dying, death, and grief before I experienced it through my father's 10-year decline from Alzheimer's and all the grief and mourning that followed it. So the book is really a field guide commingled with this journey where my father's Alzheimer's and death forced me to evolve from rabbi to son, from the professional to the personal. And hopefully it will help others as well. That's certainly the hope. So that's really in a nutshell. And it's called The Beauty of What Remains because death takes away so much. It robs us of so much that it's often difficult to embrace the beauty of what remains. And yet the beauty of what remains, if embraced, is meaning. In your, I think in the lexicon of your book, I would say that that's my exhibit or definition or example or metaphor for meaning, is that we do see and hold and embrace the beauty that remains. And some things, frankly, about people are more beautiful after death than they were before. So we'll get into all of that. So The format we've chosen, for better or for worse, is David and I are going to be able to ask each other questions. And I'm going to begin with my first question for you. I have so many, but
Before we get to your first question, I just need to put your mind at ease.
yes.
There's one thing you said, you hope your book will help people.
Mm.
I have had the privilege of reading your book. There is no doubt your book will help people when it comes out.
Thank you.
So let go of that thought.
Okay,
Your
good,
book will
good.
be helping.
Thank you. That helps. Thank you. So here's my first question for you. Do we, in the context of death and the grief that follows, do we search for meaning? Does one actually search for meaning actively, or does meaning reveal itself to us along the way if we just keep going?
It's interesting. I think of Michelangelo, the great artist, who was once asked how he creates these amazing statues like the David. And he said, I don't create them. I remove the excess.
Yes, the beauty of what remains. That's right.
The statue is already in there. And I think we both have said that in our books and in our work already. And, you know, I think that part of my work is helping people get rid of the guilt, the what ifs, the if onlys, the self-blame, the misconceptions. I try to remove all of that so that they can get to the pure grief.
Mm.
Now, the pure grief doesn't mean you're not going to have pain. A loved one dying is a painful experience. However, there's a suffering that our mind does to us that can be very, very challenging and often not true. We have a cruel, protective mind. And as you saw in the book, I talked a lot about how brain science works, that protective mind that helps us can also be the mind that turns on us in our worst moments. And so meaning, I think, is what you find underneath. And a couple things I always say to people about meaning. Meaning doesn't take away the pain. Meaning is a cushion. And the second thing is, people will often say, there's no meaning in a loved one's death from cancer or Alzheimer's or the pandemic. And I'll go, no, you're right. There's no meaning in that horrible death. Meaning is in us. Meaning is what we do afterwards.
So it's a combination, you would say, of active work and searching and the removing of everything that stands in the way of meaning.
And recognizing and naming it. So for instance, right now, you and I are having a meaningful conversation.
Mm-hmm.
This conversation is meaningful to me. I hope it is to you. I hope to the people who watch this today and years down the road, that we honor today my son, your father, and all our loved ones who have died.
Mm-hmm.
That's meaningful. So just to name these meaningful moments that occur all around us every day.
Mm-hmm. 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 Beautiful.
So I want to ask you, you mentioned about your training, and we talked about this earlier. The idea that so many clergy, because I teach physicians and nurses and clergy and therapists, and they all, including clergy, often say, we were taught about death, but not about the experience of grieving. And even though it's my world, my losses had been years ago, decades ago. I thought my tragedies were behind me in my childhood until I became 90, they were going to come again. But somewhat the same as you, Rabbi, when I was in the epicenter of the pain, I wanted to write a note to every person I'd counseled, especially parents, and saying, I forgot how bad the pain is.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand how bad that pain feels. So what's this experience been like for you to realize, oh, I'm in my own experience of loss hitting a deficit here?
Well, you know, I'll kind of walk you through the steps of these realizations for me. The first was when my father was in a nursing home for 10 years with Alzheimer's, and I had visited people who were not my father, obviously, in nursing homes for many years before that, and I'd counseled families, and I got it completely wrong. We received no training in that regard in rabbinical school. The truth is of rabbinical school is that most of what you learn about being a rabbi, you learn after, not during your training.
Like a lot of professions.
Yeah, I think medicine is like that. I think a lot of things are like that. And I distinctly remember walking into the chapel for my father's funeral, and the young rabbi of my parents' synagogue was walking us in. And I remember saying to myself, well, I understand how the rabbi feels right now because I've done it literally 1,000 times. But I never understood until now how the mourner feels, how surreal it is, how heavy it is, the degree of disbelief that comes along with it. And so that was the first thing is I only by living it could I understand the fog of death, which I did not understand before. The second thing I would say is, and this might sound so odd coming from a rabbi, but it deepened my love for my faith because I discovered in a way I had not understood before the wisdom of Jewish mourning rituals and practices, how the holding environment that they create for the mourner, how you're taken care of under those circumstances, how the first 3 days, the first 7 days, the first 30 days, the first 11 months, the rhythm set out for us by the sages 2,000 years ago, how wise and healing that is. And you talked earlier about healing grief. I think people often confuse healing and curing. I don't think you ever cure grief, but you can heal. And I realized how the tradition helped me heal. And every religion structures the chaos of death in its own way, but many of them quite beautiful and helpful. So I'm a completely different rabbi helping families now than I was before my father died. It's one of the gifts my father has posthumously given me. I don't say certain things I used to say. I say things I didn't say. I know better when to be silent. So it changed me profoundly. And in a way, to your point about meaning, that has made me appreciate my father even more.
And I think when we talk about meaning can be that appreciation of your father. Meaning can be when someone we love dies in a way they shouldn't have.
Yeah.
Maybe we make the world better so that no one else dies that way. It also can be we realize the brevity of life, that this is a gift.
Yes.
We also see that not everyone's going to do a foundation or a charity. Sometimes just those meaningful moments that we don't even understand. One of the things I always share, and I'm sure you read this in the book, is that my son, my younger son, needed to get insurance, healthcare insurance. And he was in school, there was not insurance, so he just needed to get it. And there were lots of issues around that. And I knew getting insurance with him was going to be a tense, complicated affair. And we met, and I just picked out an insurance agent out of the blue. We met, opened the door, and this woman walked in with a big pink streak through her hair and was bouncing. And I thought, oh, this is going to be going very badly. And somehow, just because of who she was, she made that insurance meeting that could have been tense, light, fun, actually enjoyable. And so I walked away and said goodbye to my son thinking, that wasn't bad. And he was like, no, it wasn't. We hugged, said, I loved you, made plans to see each other soon. It turned out to be the last time I ever saw him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who that insurance person was changed my life.
Yeah.
We have the power to do that in a million moments. We have no idea.
Yes. And sometimes we frankly do have the idea. I mean, I get in my car and go to do extremely difficult things knowing it matters that I show up. It not that it's the easy thing to do, but just, walking across a threshold is a powerful act of human kindness. Just physically showing up. All right, let me ask you another question, if I may. Okay. You have a very, I think, such a perfect metaphor for grief, where you talk about sinking lower and lower underwater, down and down and down and down and down. And there is a point at which one hits bottom.
Yeah, I can't even take credit for that. That was Diane Gray, who was head of the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation. She called me at one point and she said to me, and she's a bereaved mother herself, she said, I know you are drowning, and you are going to drown for a long time. And at some point you are going to hit the bottom, and you have a decision to make. Do you stay there or do you swim again?
Do you push off the bottom?
Do I push off the bottom? And I'll tell you, for me, it was like, I don't think I'll ever swim again.
Yes. Yes.
And yet she planted a seed. And that seed is the decision that we all have to make in grief.
Well,
Do we live again or swim again?
That's my question is in your vast experience, Heinrich Heine had a joke about the Jews. He said, the Jews are like everyone else, just more so. So in my experience, death doesn't give people a new personality. It makes them more so. So you are a push off the bottom sort of guy, right? You hit bottom and you push off and reach for the surface again. What is the difference, do you think, between the person who can push off the bottom, and why do some people stay there?
That's my question for you. So
Well,
that's the problem.
We can both answer it.
So a few things. One, I would say there was absolutely clarity in my mind. I was never going to teach again. I was never going to help anyone with grief. That part of my life was done. I was staying at the bottom. That was absolutely part of my life. So, but I did go, so is this just going to be constant pain? Is this going to honor my son? I don't know that this is where I want to stay. The other thing is, we live in a world, this, so many people here know this, wounded people wound people. So many of us have been wounded in our lives. And one of the things we don't understand is when grief comes along, it doesn't mature us all the time. Sometimes it magnifies our wounds.
Makes us more so.
A lot of us have wounds and learned helplessness that we stay where we are. We don't even know how to move forward. We're a grief illiterate society. We don't know how to do this. So, I always joke with people, you come from a long line of dead people. I mean, every ancestor you've ever had has died. Your body, your soul, your psyche knows how to do this. Society tells us you got to be over it in 3 days, you got to be over it in a month, you shouldn't feel it, be strong, don't cry, whatever it may be. that really gets in the way with this organic process. Our soul and psyche and body were built to take a number of hits this lifetime. We were designed for loss. But when you squelch all that and say, don't feel it, don't experience it, it causes the reverse. It makes it problematic for our healing.
Yeah, I
So
agree
right
with you.
back right back at you. What do you think sort of gets in the way of us choosing to live again and living again a life that honors our loved one, doesn't move on from it?
Yeah, I think much of what you said I agree with. I would add a few things. One is, I think that many people expect grief to be linear.
Right.
They expect it to slowly get better until it's gone.
Right.
And removing that expectation and helping people to understand that the shortest distance between 2 points is not a straight line when you're talking about grief, that it is circuitous. I tell people all the time, I like the metaphor of waves. It comes in waves, and occasionally there are rogue waves that you don't expect. And
there's undertow.
Yes, and this is the counterintuitive part that I think is important when it comes to grief.
Right.
You have two choices when you're hit by a wave. You can try to stand up in it, against it, and what happens is you end up being thrown upside down and gasping for air and thrashed against the rocks. Or you can succumb to it and float with it. And then when you're able, when it passes, you stand up again. And to me, that is the more productive, better, more humane way to go through grief. But you are 100% right. Our society wants to move us along. What I have people come to me all the time, and I'm paraphrasing, but they're basically saying to me, why don't I feel better?
Right.
Like, what's wrong with me? And of course, the answer is nothing's wrong with you. You're a human being and you've been wounded.
And you're not broken. You're in grief.
That's right. So I think it's the same. I think that giving people permission to stay on the bottom for a while is the surest way to enable them to push off. That's my opinion, as counterintuitive as that may sound.
The other thing I want to just say along those lines is that there's no timeline in grief, but I do have 3 areas I think about. There's anticipatory grief. That's the grief before the death.
Mm-hmm.
We all know our parents will die someday. A loved one gets a diagnosis. Then there's, of course, the death. And I think there's a phase that's different for everyone called the acute phase, when you're just in it.
Yeah.
It just happened. And for some, that's a week. For others, it's months. And then we have what I call early grief. Now, here's the surprising thing. If I went out to the street and just asked people on the boulevard, walking by stores, when's early grief? They would say a week, a month, 6 months, the first year. I tell people early grief is the first 2 years.
I think you're right.
And just for them to realize that, oh, I've been thinking I should be over it at 3 months. I'm far from it.
I didn't write this book until 2 years after my father's death.
Right.
I think you're 100% right. I think it is a couple of years. By the way, it's not just the loss associated with death. I've seen many people through very difficult medical challenges, including, disfiguring surgeries, for example. And it takes most people a couple of years to actually get used to the way their body looks after some kind of, disfiguring surgery. It takes time. So I think I'm right there with you. All right, my next question for you is, do you personally believe, or what is your personal belief about the afterlife? And I specifically am asking you because of the incredibly moving story of you visiting many years later the ICU room in the abandoned, dilapidated hospital where your mother died, and that green light being on in the very room where she died, and you were not allowed to be present. And Brandon's kidney, the story of Brandon's kidney in your book, which is just, too powerful to be merely coincidental in my mind, at least. So what is your view of the eternality of the soul, of the afterlife?
Well, I wasn't sure. I always say I'm an open skeptic, but a few things changed that in my life. One, my father, when he was dying, I had seen, because I worked for decades in hospice and palliative care and end of life. My original work is in hospitals with the dying. And so many people would have a deathbed vision. They would see a loved one coming to greet them.
Yeah.
And when my father was dying, in my own home, with hospice, the company I worked for, he was having a tough time. And I felt awful that somehow I should be able to give my father a good experience of death. And he wasn't having a good experience of death. And felt like he was old and ready to go. It wasn't that. But I saw him be so sad and so depressed. And then about 2 days before, something changed. And I said, what happened? What? You seem okay. And he said, your mother came to me. And she told me we're all going to be together again sometime and that it's okay. And my father was not someone who was ever someone to think about, oh, I was visited by this. I mean, that wasn't my father.
He was a rationalist.
Yeah. So he wasn't going to have that. He's not oh, there's a leaf, it's my loved one. That's not him. So I began studying deathbed visions and was surprised at how common they are. That, our loved ones seem to greet us.
And dreams, deathbed dreams also.
Right.
Yes.
And there's, the veil between life and death seems to shift when we're dying, when we're in the dream state, those things. So, and then just like you mentioned, I had those experiences where my own mother, I wasn't able to be with her and I could never walk through this door. And I finally, over 40 years later, got to the hospital when it's closed, ready to be torn down, and was able to get in and finally get past the ICU doors, which were shockingly still there, and walk in. And it was emergency power in the hospital because they were still using some of it for office space. And there's this green blinking light over where her bed was. No one could have known what bed was hers 45 years ago.
And it was the only blinking light.
It was the only blinking light. We'd been through like three, units. And this was after Hurricane Katrina. The hospital had been destroyed. I stood there in the same spot. I only got to come a couple of times and see her. And I stood there and I really thought about, what's that green light mean to me? And how this was such a powerful place to me. Where my mother left, was it a powerful place for her too? Was she greeting me there? I think about what's green mean? It means complete. It means it's safe to go.
Go forward.
Go forward. We also, when you go to see your doctor and you're ready to be seen, they turn the green light on. So I really, there was something like that for me. It's just not explainable.
Do you think it is our own projection? Do you think it's real, or doesn't it matter?
Like I said, I'm so much of a skeptic. I need blatant things to happen. There's one other thing I'll tell you about that. When this book came out, well, first of all, my son had a shirt that was his favorite. And it was like something that there were so many times he had put the shirt on, like, David, you got to be more dressed up. You can't wear that shirt where we're going. We had those things. When he died, he was wearing that shirt. His girlfriend, after he died, I said to her, do you want anything here in his apartment? She goes, I want the shirt. I was like, darn it, I wanted that shirt. She got the shirt. A year later, when we're at his grave, she brings the shirt and says, I just feel like I'm not supposed to have it. She puts it down. I grab the shirt, I'll take it before anyone else gets it. I bring it home, I seal it to make sure the smell is there. I put it away. People start showing up at my lectures in the same exact shirt. Like at the lectures, at the retreat.
Yeah.
And then I was doing the first retreat here in LAX on the book. And I was so stressed out because it was this weird mixture of a book coming out professionally about my son dying. I'm doing my first retreat. I hear the LA Times is coming. And then I heard producer from OWN is coming. And I was like, oh no, Oprah Winfrey Network, I can't do this. I can't do this. I was like, I don't know if this is the right thing to do. I don't know if I feel right about this. All of a sudden, I go to the retreat. The Oprah Winfrey producer sits down. She's wearing the shirt. The interesting thing is, she didn't know it. I told the story just like that to the group about at the end of day one. And she walks up to me and she goes, I'm wearing the shirt, aren't I? And I said, how would you know if you're wearing the shirt? Because I don't tell anyone what the shirt looks like. She goes, I'm someone who throws on the clothes and leaves. Today, I changed my shirt 7 times until I finally put this one on.
Yeah.
I don't know how to explain those things. What about you? Because I've heard so much in Judaism that, oh, no, we don't believe in an afterlife.
Well, like anything, when you're asking about Judaism, you know, it's a 3,000-year-old tradition. So the answer is on the one hand, on the other hand, always. There's a very sophisticated afterlife in the Talmud. I mean, the very sophisticated description of the afterlife. So it was when, after the Enlightenment, when many Jews became sort of hyper-rationalists, we kind of made those parts of our tradition disappear because they were non or anti-rational, but they exist. Look, I will say, first of all, I have seen 1,000 dead bodies. Without that is not rabbinic hyperbole. I've seen 1,000 dead bodies, and any of us who have seen a dead body, we know that is not who that person was. That there is so much more to us than our bodies, so much more. And so I personally, I mean, I would call it a soul. People can call it energy, a presence, whatever you want to call it. It is the non-material aspect of who we are, which to me is far more defining than our physical appearance or bodies. So that's the first thing. I do believe that there is much to us beyond the physical. So in that sense, yes. And Judaism supports that as well. And I mean, Maimonides called it the transmigration of the soul, but the idea of soul is very deeply embedded in Judaism. That's the first thing. And so that's a misnomer about Judaism. And I can tell you, I have just heard over the years too many stories like yours to dismiss them as mere coincidence. There's too much anecdotal evidence to the contrary. You know, for me, I wrote about it in my book. My father, who you know because you read it, was not an easy guy.
Which, by the way, I just want to say that's so lovely about the book. I came away wanting to know him.
Yeah.
I'm like, you know.
Yeah, he was something, that's for sure. So my father was a very, in my childhood, a pretty harsh father, pretty demanding. But there was this one thing. He used to get all 5 of us with my mom in the station wagon on Sundays. We'd go for a drive, and he would sing "You Are My Sunshine" to us. And it was one of those, unfortunately, all too rare times in my childhood when I really knew he loved us. I really knew it because of that simple song. I started this book and at my sister's house in Palm Springs when she wasn't there. And I went for a walk at night when it cooled off around the golf course that I had walked with my father hundreds of times, not to play golf, just to walk around the court, walk around the outside. And as I was walking there on a patio, facing the golf course were the lyrics to You Are My Sunshine on somebody's back porch.
Wow.
You know, to me, that's enough. He was there.
Right.
And he's there every time I leave a room and turn off the light to save money. He's there, you know, every time. My father was a very frugal person. He reused his dental floss, just to give you a benchmark. You know, every time I try not to waste something, you know, every time I come up with the perfect Yiddish word that would have been his to describe a situation or a person. So I believe there is an afterlife. And frankly, if it's a human projection, if it's my own projection, I don't really care.
Right.
It's still an afterlife, right?
And the other thing I find interesting that I always tell people, and you're such an example of this in what you just said, people will often say to me, you know, David, when my loved one died, a part of me died with them. And I'll go, yes. And a part of them lives on in you.
That's right.
And you talked beautifully about that in the book. The other thing I just want to mention, and shockingly, it's time for questions.
Wow.
We blew through that very quickly.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
The other thing is, people do always say to me, do you believe there's life after death for those who have died? And I say, yes. There's another question. Do we believe there's life after death for us?
That's right.
Do we get to live?
Yeah.
That's an important question. And I just want to say, for anyone out there who's dealing with loss, especially during this time with not a lot of grief groups, you heard that the rabbi was on, did my free grief group. You can find that at grief.com, because no one should have to suffer alone, especially in these times.
Yeah. Yeah. It's important work you're doing.
Thank you.
All right, let's take some questions, Vicki.
First of all, I want to thank both of you for the privilege of allowing us to listen to this conversation. It really is so inspiring to hear your such brilliant conversation, and we are so grateful to both of you for enlightening us about grief and loss, and giving us such words of wisdom and comfort. So thank you to both of you. It's truly a privilege for all of us, the 543 people that are tuned in today for this talk. We have a lot of questions here, some about the pandemic. This question is from Robert. The pandemic has changed the way people grieve. For those who have recently lost loved ones, the normal rituals of grief have not been possible. Is there advice you have for those of us in this circumstance?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, David. You want to take that?
Let me talk about the pandemic in general, and then you're so brilliant on the rituals. I would say this, the pandemic, like no other time, has filled this year with so many losses. We don't often know how to bring these losses together, because it's a time of what I call macro losses and micro losses, big and little. You're experiencing, Robert, I'm so sorry, the death of a loved one, which is, of course, the biggest loss we can experience. But there's also weddings that got canceled. There's graduations. There's jobs that have been lost. So many things. Just the ability to hug one another or visit with one another. And I think we realize grief is such a limiting word that it encompasses all these losses. Two concepts that are important to know. Grief is a no judgment zone. And there's no comparing in grief, because if you compare, if you win, you lose. So for example, right now, if someone was to tell me their wedding was postponed and they're just devastated, I would not say to them, you can have another wedding next year. My son's dead. How dare you complain about that? I recognize we live in a world big enough for all the losses to exist together. Her loss does not take away from mine. We both get to have our losses. When people say to me, which is the worst loss? I always say, yours, the one you're going through. So the rituals, the one thing I will say about that is so many people in my group have had a loved one who died. They weren't able to be there. They're heartbroken. I just try to remind them our death is one day in our loved one's life. And they died with all of your love that you gave them over the years. Rabbi?
I'm a big believer in focusing on the upside of the downside. There are some aspects of mourning that are really hamstrung by the pandemic, but not all of them. And frankly, some of the least helpful components of mourning during ordinary times have been erased by the pandemic in a positive way. I just went through this last week. I officiated a funeral for a 57-year-old man with 4 grown children who died of brain cancer, and his beautiful relationship with his wife, beautiful marriage. And she said, I'm just so sorry that all of his friends can't be there. And there would be 400 people at the funeral if it wasn't for COVID. And I said to her, let me tell you about the exhaustion of a 400-person funeral and what that would be like for you to carry, and how fortunate you are that it's just going to be you and the kids, so that you can really focus on and take care of each other, and that you don't have to entertain or respond to or even mingle with 400 people, 350 of whom you don't really care about and are not going to be helpful to you. Shiva, for example. People say, oh, we can't have Shiva. I said, well, that's true. You can't have 50, 60, 70 people at your home. It'll just be 10. On the other hand, there will be people from all over the world who can join us on this Zoom Shiva that never could have come to your home in Brentwood and want to be with you and want to express their feelings. So I'll just quickly tell you, there was a Soviet psychologist named Bluma Zerganik, and she did an experiment where she showed people a picture of a circle with a wedge cut out of it, and then tracked their eye movement. And their eye movement went to the missing piece every time, on what wasn't there, on what they couldn't do. And a lot of us make that mistake, not with all kinds of loss. So I'm a big believer in leaning into the possible rather than spending a lot of time in angst over what is not possible under these circumstances. I find these small weddings and funerals to be much, much, much more meaningful for people than these massive gatherings. So I think in that way, COVID has been a gift. And that's quite a statement, but I'm qualifying it by saying it only in these very particular ways, because it's certainly not a gift. I'm not saying that any of this is worth it. I'm merely saying it isn't worthless.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, David. That phrase, leaning into the possible, is
Yes.
a very important one. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's something that all of us that are listening today can keep in mind.
Well, and the thing, just to add to that, we always talk about the missing piece. We always talk about post-traumatic stress. The reality is, one of the things I talk about in the book is post-traumatic growth.
That's right.
Actually happens more, and we don't give that as much airtime as it deserves.
It's so true. There are certain things only death can teach us. It is the great teacher. Kafka said the meaning of life is that it ends. That's a very powerful idea. The meaning of life is that it ends. Death is a powerful teacher. It has been for me.
All right, Vicki, what you got there?
Okay, question from Eric. I bottled up the grief of losing my daughter by taking care of others and turning off my emotions. Been over 2 years, and now I'm finding I can't talk about her. Do you have any suggestions for starting to grieve after all this time has passed? I am quite numb.
I would just start with get support and do not judge yourself for doing it wrong. Sometimes when we're just in a survival mode, we can't attend to the grief, but it's ready to be attended to now. How do I know? Because you're here talking about it. So get help. There's so many places. Reach out. Grief.com has a listing of therapists, There's free grief groups. I have a free grief group. The death of a child. When my son died, I needed a grief organization, a grief counselor, a free grief group. I have a paid group that has many people on it. Get help and support. You know, one of the things I'm shocked at, we don't think twice about when the air conditioner breaks, we call in someone for support. When the car breaks, we bring it to the mechanic for support. Your daughter dies, and we're like, I don't know that I need help. Get support. However that looks for you, get support. And it's the perfect time if it's coming up now.
Yeah. The Talmud says the prisoner cannot free himself. The prisoner cannot free himself. We have to reach out. My current book is about pain, not about death specifically. And I know David would concur. All the research shows that no one suffers pain better alone. Absolutely no one suffers pain better alone. You need to reach out, and you're getting excellent advice from the world-class expert from David, and I would take it.
And I'll tell you, thank you for that. And so many people talk about right now the isolation, the loneliness. The only antidote for isolation and loneliness is connection, even if it's virtual.
Yeah, reach out.
So I do like rooms where 4 people get in a room and talk to each other about their grief. So lots of help out there. By the way, there's also a site I have called griefoverwhelm.com. It's 10 things you can do right now when you're overwhelmed. That's griefoverwhelm.com. Just some simple things you can do to help you.
Thank you. I'm just in awe of how much advice and help you both are giving people right now virtually. And it's just so thankful for what you are doing for our community. We have time for one last question from Megan. My mom died 37 years ago when I was 18. Why is it that every loss since then, relationship, job, anything, sends me back to the loss of her? Why does it always go back to her?
I think
You
that's
have not healed from her loss.
well. I'm not. I can't anticipate. I'm not sure what the concern in the question is, but to me, it seems I would flip the question around. How could it not all go back to her? To me, it seems perfectly sensible that each loss reactivates the pain of having lost her mother. To me, it's not surprising. It's something to be embraced. Not, to me, it makes perfect sense. You know, I often, when I'm with a family for the second or third funeral in their family, and they can't quite understand their feelings, and then I point out to them, well, this is reactivating the previous funerals that you've endured and been through and experienced, and then they go, oh, of course it is. So to me, it's a very real and understandable connection. And I guess what I would say is, it's been 37 years and you have found a way to move forward after the death of your mother. Can you apply that same pushing off the bottom to whatever the current loss is that you're dealing? In other words, you have been here before. You know how to do this. You are a survivor of loss, and can you find that within you for this current loss, just as you did for the previous loss?
And I would agree with that new losses bring up old losses, and that's a primal loss long ago. A wording that I use and the rabbi uses, grief speaks.
Mm-hmm.
I would at least want to have a conversation. Is there something back then that is still unattended, that is asking for a little attention? And like the rabbi says, it literally could be one loss triggers old losses. And there might be something else there that's asking for healing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you both. I know I said that was the last question, but there's one more question here that I just feel we really need to address. It's from Melinda. It says, my question is for both of you. I am the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and in some ways, I feel I was born already steeped in grief. What is your opinion on epigenetics and intergenerational trauma as it relates to grief?
I'm a big believer that grief gets passed down. That's why I think grief work is so important, because you're healing not only yourself, but the generations to come. And you know, if you think about it, any family member that we talk about who's had a rough time and is so wounded by life, there was often a death there. And certainly if it's the Holocaust, there's so much there. So of course, it's almost like the rabbi said, how could that not impact you? How could there not be intergenerational grief? And, you know, it's not whether you have it or not, it's what you do with it now. And Rabbi, I'll give you the last word on all that.
Well, I think the important word in the question is, I am the child of a Holocaust survivor.
Right.
And just as the grief and trauma of the Holocaust has been placed upon the shoulders of the next generation, can you, I would say, improve upon the survival instincts and behaviors of your parents? Like, they figured out a way to survive this. I don't mean physically. They're alive. They got married. They had you. They had a life. I'm sure there was laughter and love and chocolate and sex and vacations, and they found a way to live. Can you improve upon that even more so? You know, Dostoevsky said that his greatest fear was that his life would not be worthy of his suffering. I think that's a very profound idea. Can we lead a life that is worthy of our suffering? And in your case, I would say, can you lead a life that is worthy of your parents' suffering and your own suffering? And I would be focusing on that because that's a healing way to proceed.
On that note, I want to thank David Kessler, Rabbi Leader. This was the most incredible hour. We are honored to be with you, and thank you for sharing all your wisdom with our open mind audience. It truly was a pleasure, a privilege and a pleasure to be with you this hour. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to everybody that tuned in today. We look forward to seeing you at our next programs. All are on our website, friendsoftheseminoinstitute.org. This program will also be on our website tomorrow. So if you want to watch it again or have your friends or family tune in, they will have an opportunity to see this incredible conversation between these two brilliant scholars. So thank you very much, everyone. Be safe, be well, and just take care of yourselves. Good night.
Good night. David, it was an honor to be with you.
Always with you too. Thank you. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, everyone.